Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Tough topic today. Let's do it. What's the most horrific thing you have ever witnessed? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
I was 8 at the time, and my dad had surgery a few weeks before for something that I can't remember. Apparently something was wrong, and he started urinating blood. He yelled for my mom because he was about to pass out from blood loss. She ran in and caught him as he was falling over in the bathroom. My dad is 6'2" and weighs upwards of 220, and my mom is 5'3" and just over 100. He passed out and pinned her against the corner. She yelled at me to call 911, and when I ran in there, I saw my dad unconscious with his eyes open and my mom crying and yelling for the phone. I thought my dad had died. He made a full recovery, but I've never been so scared in my life. I didn't actually witness this, but I heard everything that was going on. I entered the hospital on February 24th, 2012 for the induction of my second daughter. I had experienced induction before, so I was familiar with the process. I was in a ward with 3 other beds, and I was the first patient of the day. The third expectant mother to come in was about an hour and a half after I arrived, and I was just about to be given the okay to go ahead with my induction. Anyway, they routinely checked her the same way they did me. Again, I couldn't see her. We were behind separate curtains. I could only hear everything happening, and all of a sudden, I hear the nurse ask, "When was the last time you felt your baby move?" She replied, "Earlier that morning." Then they asked to go into the room with the ultrasound machine. 2 minutes later, my husband and I hear a shrill scream by a number of loud bangs and a man yelling, "My baby." The woman was heard repeatedly yelling, "Why? Why?" I immediately threw up. I couldn't help but cry. The poor parents were there to have their baby, like us, and they left the hospital with nothing. I still think of them. I was on a convoy in Ramadi, Iraq. My convoy came under a complex ambush of small arms and RPG fire directly after an IED blast. An armor-piercing RPG round hit the truck in front of me around the back door. We began returning fire, and the enemy combatants retreated. The RPG round struck my friend directly in the back of the Humvee, causing it to explode inside his body. Everyone else in the truck survived, only sustaining shrapnel injuries. A portion of the material was from my friend's body. I saw a guy get pasted outside my business, probably in 2006. The car hit him going at least 50 miles per hour in a 35, and when the car hit him, he flew through the air like Superman. It turned out he was walking home from the convenience store. The man who got hit was lying on the road in a crumpled pile. Cops were called, obviously, but this was a rural area, and we had to wait for the state police. So the local EMTs were there, no ambulance, just the guys, but it didn't matter, he was dead. His girlfriend saw the activity and flashing lights and came around the corner. He was almost home and started screaming and crying. I knew her from around town. The guy who hit him was speeding for sure, and he was a doctor. However, the hit man's intoxication proved to be a point of contention, leading to the dismissal of the family's case. I had to give a deposition at my lawyer's, who happened to be the same one handling the case. The next day, I was walking around outside and found a bunch of Slim Jims in the grass. I guess that's what he got at the convenience store. In high school, some friends and I met a couple of girls outside of my hometown at an old quarry that had become a place to swim and drink beer. We didn't know they were there when we showed up. We talked with them a while and made plans to meet up back in town later that night. They left about 15 minutes before us. On the way back, we came upon an accident. Turns out the girls rounded a corner too wide and clipped a cement truck, sending them down an embankment. By chance, Our local coroner had been following the truck and was pulling the now dead girls up the hill. I walked up just as he was carrying the girl I talked to the most and was looking forward to seeing later, when her head flopped back and her face flapped back over her forehead, exposing her skull. It was by far the most gut-wrenching, horrible thing I've ever seen. She was having a blast 30 minutes before, and now she was a corpse. I just went home and sat in my room the rest of the night. My parents wondered what was wrong, but I never told them. Back in the 80s, some friends and I were walking in the city of Burbank. I don't remember the street names, but there's a major 7-way intersection there. We were waiting to cross one of the streets when a motorcycle shot through at 100 miles an hour. He plowed nearly straight into the front of a VW bus that was making a legal left turn. The front half of the bike disappeared into the VW front, while the rider slammed into the front and windscreen. The windscreen shattered as the rider's head tore off and kept going, into the chest of the VW bus driver. He started screaming, just like two of the girls that were with us. The girls freaked, and we didn't stay to watch more. I really wish I had. In my 20s, I had my own business in an industrial park. The units were about 1,000 square feet, usually divided into offices and warehouses. The units were in long rows back to back. My friend ran an industrial scale business not far from mine. One night, he calls me and says, "Can you come up to my unit?" So I come into his unit, and it's filled with a strange, smoky haze. It's an odd smell I can't place, but somehow it included a gasoline-esque aftertaste. It was Christmas time, and I joked, "What the hell? Is your neighbor committing suicide? Hey, let's leave quickly to avoid any potential fire hazards. This way, if your phone rings, it won't blow us up." So we go back to my office, and I call the fire department. Before I could hang up the phone, I could hear the fire engines on the way. Super surreal. I found out later they respond quickly to anything in these industrial parks because of meth labs and their propensity to explode. Firemen show up, and it's like the Keystone Cops. They're running around my friend's office looking for the odor. To me, the irony lies in the fact that they're all engaged in smoking. Like, "What do you think it is, Bob?" "I don't know. Smells flammable, though." What the? They go around to the unit behind my friends, and it's all locked up. They spent a considerable amount of time making phone calls and taking other necessary steps to secure permission to investigate. They took great care to avoid causing any damage and carefully removed the pins from the door hinges to gain entry. Bingo. The neighbor had pulled his car into his unit and had killed himself by inhaling the exhaust fumes. Seeing his body lying there on the ground, so purposefully posed next to the tailpipe, dead, remains one of the most haunting images in my mind. That and some nasty shit I saw on the internet. In grade 10, one of my best friends, Mike, committed suicide. He was severely depressed. I had been talking to him for weeks, urging him to seek help for his depression. One day I got a text message from him saying he was done with life and that he was at a local park and was going to hang himself. I immediately texted him back, urging him not to do it, and I told him I would be at the park soon and that we could talk. I even called him, but he didn't pick up. I ran as fast as I could to the park, and when I got there, I saw him hanging there. I couldn't believe what was right before my eyes. I was in shock. I called the police and his mother. To this day, I have been unable to get the image of him hanging there out of my head. Every day I wonder if there was anything I could have said that would have prevented him from killing himself and getting the help he needed. This is one of the most horrifying things I've seen. About 10 years ago, I was living in Montreal. I was walking home from work. A bunch of people were standing at the crosswalk waiting to cross. The light didn't signal for us to cross yet, but for some reason, a lady pushed a few of us aside and ran right into the street, and bam, a bus smashed into her. Her body was thrown about 5 to 8 feet in front of the bus, like a rag doll, and her body continued to tumble forward. I guess the impact she made in the concrete ended up scraping her really well, because there was blood literally gushing out of her head. I hate to say this, but it was honestly like a water fountain. People rushed toward us to try and stop the bleeding, but she obviously didn't make it. It still traumatizes me, causing me to be cringe every time I see someone hit by a car or bus on TV.
This is more a warning for people. Again, what happens in the next story was not intentional. It does involve a dog being hit by a car. It was not done intentionally. Like I said, it was an accident. But you've already listened to stories of human beings and babies dying. So if that is sensitive to you, be mindful. There's also one later on, similar situation. So again, the topic is pretty dark. But there's only 2 instances that I read today that do involve animals being hit by vehicles. So be mindful and enjoy. This is a tough topic. All right. Have a good day, everyone.
When I was 13, I was skating with a buddy on decently busy street. Every day we skated on this section of curb where the shoulder grew wider and the pavement was smooth. Across the street lived this 8-year-old kid that totally looked up to my friend and me. He'd come out and skate with us from time to time. He wasn't very good, but he would get some speed, pop his board, jump off, and throw his hands up in the air in frustration, like he was trying to land something, but couldn't. One day, this little guy got a little pug. He ran across the street, yelling about how he got a dog, and we should come see it. We brushed him off, saying we'd come see it sometime. That wasn't good enough for him. He ran back across the street and came back with his new puppy, but with no leash. We gave it a pet while he held it in his arms, but the dog was wriggling around so much, this little kid could barely hang on to it. We told him he should put the dog back in his yard, warning him that he could get loose. So he scampered across the street toward his backyard with the little pug squirming in his arms. He made it around the fence and into his backyard when I heard him scream. His dog slipped out of his hands before he could close the gate, and the little pug came out bolting straight toward my buddy and me. As soon as he hit the street, he was struck by a minivan. Time slowed down. I saw the dog's face, so happy as he ran toward us. I saw the surprise on her face when the lady who was driving hit something. I saw the little guy flip up a few feet in the air and come back down. I saw the whole thing happen, and when everything stopped, I saw the little kid standing frozen across the street. Tears filled his eyes as he bawled and ran inside. His mom ran out right as the lady who hit the dog was walking up crying. I ran over to help, but the little pug was lying there, slowly panting with blood coming out of its mouth. I picked him up out of the street and laid him in the grass. The lady briefly explained what had happened to the mother, then left without saying anything more. The mother was serene about it. She said accidents happen and went in to call someone to take care of the dog. I went home and cried myself to sleep that night. I kept replaying it in my head and couldn't help but think it was my fault. It was running toward us, and if we weren't such asshole teenagers, we would have gone over and seen the dog when he asked us. After returning from the pub, I thought it would be a great idea to sit on the shed's roof, enjoy another beer, gaze at the stars, and engage in conversation. Fast forward 20 minutes, we'd been finished with our beers and are going to get down. I climb down fine, then my friend stands up, and the roof gives way beneath her. She falls and smashes her head on the concrete below, which makes a massive dent in her skull. At the time I was extremely frightened, but fortunately she survived with only minor injuries. Oh, and then when I was fixing the roof, she managed to break it again when passing me the drill. My family and I went on vacation, and we ended up being stuck about 12 cars back because of a road blockade on a mountainous, curvy road. Apparently a truck was transporting stuff, I think it was hay, in the back of his truck, which was toppled off his truck, forcing the blockade for the cleanup. Anyways, the line of waiting vehicles keeps growing and growing. After 30 minutes of waiting, I get bored and ask my cousin if he wants to get out of the vehicle for a bit. He says to me, "Not right now," which saved my life. After a few minutes, a sudden, loud rumbling shook our vehicle violently. Within seconds, a semi, which was hauling probably more than it should have, crashed into every vehicle in front of mine, leaving a huge cloud of dust and screaming in the air. Several individuals lost their lives, while the truck's driver suffered a severe head injury. His truck lost its brakes due to the heavy load he was transporting through the mountain road. Years later, I still can't get the bloody people, the girl who lost her legs to this crash, or the wheezing breathing of the guy who had every bone in his body crushed and clinging to life, out of my head. My grandpa was severely constipated for about 2 weeks and having horrible stomach pains. My grandma called and said my grandpa was bleeding a bit when trying to use the bathroom, and that I needed to come over. I live on the other side of a small town, so I was there in about 5 minutes. What I saw will never leave me, ever. I came into the bathroom to find the entire floor soaked in blood, bloody handprints all over the walls, and chunks of my grandfather's intestines all over the place. He had gone to get up after using the bathroom, and something inside of him erupted, causing the massive blood loss. The scene left me in a state of shock, with my grandpa at its center. He was as white as a ghost, frail and shivering. Our eyes met, and he simply said, "I love you guys so much." The paramedics arrived, took him off to the hospital, and that tough old bastard survived it. He had a colostomy bag for a while and a few surgeries, but he lived through it and still here another 10 years later. I love my grandpa. He's the type of person this world could use a whole lot more of. He's kind, hardworking, and completely selfless. He just wants to see the world happy. I'm truly lucky to have such a great person in my life, and almost losing him made me realize how lucky I am. Bridge wobble. I never knew until it got stuck in a jam on one because a semi ran out of gas. I was 13-ish and was sitting in the passenger seat of my mom's car. We had come to a complete stop, and I could feel the car lurching back and forth. Every time a car passed in the opposite direction, I could see the water intermittently appear between the road and the median. It was terrifying. Everything was going smoothly until the family behind us took a brief break. It's a bridge that most people use when traveling. I was a curious 6-year-old, and his somewhat older brother noticed the exact same thing I was terrified of, but they were intrigued. I saw the older one dare his younger brother to stick his tiny arm between this death trap. I was several yards away, watching this little giddy child attempt to take his older brother's dare, and all I could do was try to scream, but my heart was pounding too loud to know if it came out or not. At that immediate moment, when he had his fingers no more than an inch from certain doom, an officer who couldn't get through the traffic toward the semi grabbed him up with such force, I thought the child was going to freak out and start crying. But the man said incredibly calming and just simply said, "Hey silly, that's not a good idea. You can get hurt, and nobody wants that." I didn't actually witness it, but I played in some stupid joke band a year or so ago, and would always go around and talk to the crowd afterwards to get to know them. I met this kid named Jacob. We got to talking and became close real fast. He ended up telling me how a year ago he was actually on the phone with his best friend when his best friend shot himself. The pain the memory evoked and the tears that flooded my eyes caused me to break down immediately. I almost killed myself when I was younger, so I know what the kid was going through, but to see how much Jacob cared, even after a year, just hurt so much. Back when I was learning how to drive, my stepfather and I happened upon a rollover accident on a deserted stretch of highway. The driver was bloody and banged up, but his girlfriend had been ejected from the car. My stepdad checked the girl, then the driver, and told me to go find a phone or flag down a cop. I drove up to the next house a few miles down and told them what had happened, after which they called the police. I circled back to see if I could help and saw my first dead body. She was young, almost my age, and very pretty. The accident didn't look like it messed her up too bad, but I imagine the car had crushed her body at some point. Lying there in a white dress surrounded by broken glass, twinkling in the headlights, it was almost like she was sleeping. What horrified me wasn't bloody or gory. It was the realization of my own mortality at that age when you feel invincible. It dawned on me that I might be driving one moment and disappear the next. When my stepdad covered her up with a blanket from our car, I vomited on the side of the road. I don't lead an action-packed life, so the first time my brother experienced a seizure comes to mind. It doesn't happen like in the movies, you know? It was a nondescript Thursday night. It was around 9 o'clock, and I was watching TV, and suddenly my father came running down the stairs, carrying my seemingly unconscious brother. He was screaming for someone to call an ambulance, which my sister did, and laid him down on the couch. My brother was sitting there, not spazzing, but something just as bad. He was gurgling with bubbles streaming out of his mouth. The feeling of not knowing what was wrong and the inability to help him was pretty bad. But the worst part was watching my father standing by him sobbing as he was wheeled out to the ambulance. He eventually did turn out all right, though, and it is not so scary now because we know what it is. I was walking back from the park one day when I was around 10 or 11 and saw a cat rolling around on the side of the road. I figured it was playing with a mouse or something, so I didn't think much of it. Then it just stopped moving. I went over to check on it, and I realized that there was blood pouring everywhere. Apparently she'd been hit by a car and was actually having a fit. I called the RSPCA, but ended up having to watch the poor thing die and couldn't do anything about it. The owner drove by a short while later and were absolutely mortified. Their kid was in the back seat of the car, but ended up getting out and seeing what had happened to her cat. The look on her face and watching her parents try to explain to her what had happened completely broke my heart. I don't think I'll ever forget that. With 4 friends, I drove around listening to music and yakking one night when I was 19. We were traveling on gravel back roads and I found myself lost. I wanted to go home, so I asked one of my friends which way to go to get back to the highway. So he pointed out the way to go and told me it was about 4 or 5 miles to the highway. Unfortunately, it was much closer than that. It was about 1.5 miles, and the intersection stop sign was covered in vegetation, so I didn't see it. I unintentionally drove straight onto the highway and collided with another vehicle. The car rolled, partially ejecting my friend from the passenger seat and crushing his head. We were in the middle of nowhere. A man who happened to live nearby heard the crash and called 911, but all the ambulances in the area were dispatched on other calls, so we ended up waiting nearly 2 hours for medical attention. The airbag is the only thing that saved my life. When the paramedics finally arrived, I remember my friend rushing over to me and saying that the paramedics thought they had a pulse on our dead friend, but I knew there was no way. We'd already covered his face with his own leather jacket well over an hour before. I still have dirt and tiny bits of gravel in my arm because it was so chewed up from road rash that they couldn't get it all out. My buddies and I had just gotten haircuts. We were maybe 12 years old. Riding our bikes, we were heading home from the barber shop, skirting the roundabout-like exit ramp of the local highway by riding on the soft shoulder. We were just goofing along, mocking each other's summer haircuts, and basically being dumbasses. Some kid stopped on his bicycle ahead of us, waiting for traffic to ease so he could cut across the service road. This huge semi went sailing by us, going pretty fast. This kid, for some reason, had decided to cross at that moment. The driver of the semi tried to avoid him, sliding slightly sideways, but the kid slipped under the rig as it shuddered and bounced to a stop. We got off our bikes and ran up just as the driver was getting out. The child was lying on the ground, his leg twitching and his body appearing to quiver. The thing was, his head had gotten caught between the drive wheels of the semi. It was just gone, pulverized. The road was littered with blood and brains. I remember standing there and starting to shake, like I couldn't control it. The driver went into shock. He just sat down in the road and started crying. The rest of the incident is hazy in my memory. It involved police and passers-by, and there was a lot of yelling and crying. We walked our bikes home. To this day, I have a really hard time cycling unless I'm on a dedicated bike path. I work in a hospital, so I see pretty awful things on a regular basis. I have two worsts for different reasons. The first is the worst gore, in which I had to roll a burn patient in the ICU so the nurse could change the pads underneath. To set the scene, burn rooms are kept very warm and tend to smell foul enough that the nurses and docs put Vicks or scented oils under their noses and top that with a droplet mask. The patient had third-degree burns on the entirety of their back, among other areas, and since it was the pads on their back being changed, I had to grab their bare back to hold them on their side. Thanks, science, for medically induced comas. After the nurse completed the procedure, I rolled the patient onto their side and released my grip. A layer of skin, scab, or ooze came off their back and stuck to my gloves. The other one is entirely different. A guy had OD'd and been out for a while. His face had started turning purple from lack of oxygen. The doctors gave him Narcan, and he woke up immediately. Narcan, an opiate blocker, transforms you from a state of oblivion to complete sobriety in approximately a minute and a half. A few minutes later, he was walking out of the ER, his face still purple as his circulation was just returning, cursing the staff because he now had to go procure another hit. When I was in Afghanistan, we came across a child probably no younger than a year or two, but it was hard to tell who had been intentionally burned in this manner. The mother was just walking down a busy sidewalk, child in her arms. She was crying pretty hard too. Everyone was just ignoring her. No one was paying them any mind. We stopped our patrol and had our interpreter convince her to step into the courtyard with us so our medics could treat the kid. They covered his wounds and gave them all the antibiotics we had, plus any food in our bags. The back of his legs, genitals, and buttocks were nothing but burns. The story the mother gave us was that he had knocked over a teapot and been burned by the water when it broke. The wounds were too big and extensive for that to have been the case, though. It was obvious that someone had done this to him intentionally, which was pretty common. Considering how dirty the country was, the wretched state of that child's wounds, and the appalling lack of any real medical attention, I'm sure the kid died. I don't think there's any way he could have lived. An infection would have set in so quickly. The mere act of breathing can induce sickness. I am unable to fathom the types of illnesses he would have contracted as a result of those injuries. Out of everything I saw and experienced, this was the single most horrible thing, and I've seen a lot of horrible things in my life. Recalling this still brings tears to my eyes. I just don't understand how anyone could do this to their children, or any child for that matter.